Daylight and Bad Dreams by Anathemis on Archive of Our Own. Part 1 of Show Me Hope Again series. Summary. 5 situations in which Aizawa Shota realizes he loves his kids. Or, Aizawa Shota's unwilling descent into fatherhood. Before we get into the story, I'd like to preface this video with a trigger warning. This story contains elements of underage smoking, suicidal thoughts, self-harm, and sexual assault. If any of these elements are potentially triggering, please proceed with caution or click off of the video entirely. Aizawa Shota prided himself on his observation skills. They were necessary assets to being a hero, after all, and an underground one at that. His tired, sore, and yet keen eyes saw everything. From the villain darting around the corner of a building in the wee early hours of the morning of his nightly patrol, to Kirishima and Kaminari passing notes around class, their subtlety being entirely unsubtle. Point was, he saw everything. Nothing went unnoticed. Mike jokingly called it his real quirk one day, erasure just being a facade, but Shota rolled his eyes and sighed. What he didn't see, however, was his growing affection for his 1A class. In fact, he was perhaps the only one that didn't see it. It began, weirdly enough, with a box of red hair dye and a morose Kirishima. Shota had, of course, noticed Kirishima's dark mood and even darker roots, and quickly came to a conclusion. After a few weeks of decreasing grades and a distinct lack of his bright grin, Shota decided to step in. "Kirishima, stay behind after class," Shota muttered, as the bell went for lunch. He saw the look of confusion on the members of the self-designated Baku squad, but Kirishima waved them off with a hand, telling them he'd meet them after. When the last student finally left the room, closing the door behind them, Kirishima and Shota were alone. "Is everything okay, sensei?" Kirishima asked, running a hand through red and brown hair. Shota hummed quietly, before nodding once. "What's wrong?" Better to just get right to it, he thought, than beat around the bush. Kirishima's eyes widened minutely before he shook his head. Nothing, sensei. Why do you ask?" His voice wavered, and Shota resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He might have a terrifying and intimidating demeanor, but if this kept on any longer, he'd lose the will to live. Having grown up with Mike, he nearly 100% knew what was getting Kirishima down, but he'd rather he just told him. "Kirishima, what's wrong?" He saw his student try his damned hardest to keep the facade up, but in the end, his shoulders sagged and his head dropped to his chest. "It's stupid," he muttered. "If it's making you upset, then it's not stupid. This class would be the death of him. Why didn't he just call it quits at the start and expel them all like he did last year?" Well, I ran out of red hair dye, and the place I usually get it hasn't had any for a few weeks, and I'm not sure where to get some, and I don't know what to do," he replied, all in one breath, before rubbing a hand over his face. "I told you, it's stupid." Shota resisted the urge to roll his eyes yet again, but sighed deeply, standing up straight, resigned to the fact that he wouldn't get much of a nap before his dinner tonight. "Meet me in the dorm common room at 4:30. He said, before walking out of the classroom, leaving behind a spluttering and confused Kirishima. True to his word, Shota was in the common room at precisely 4:30. Kirishima found him stood against a wall, eyes closed, body relaxed. Sensei?" Without acknowledging Kirishima, he opened his eyes and gestured for him to follow. They left the dorms, going to the car park behind the UA building. Kirishima's confusion was mounting by the minute, but he knew Aizawa-sensei wouldn't answer any questions anyway, so he kept his mouth shut, clambering into the passenger seat of the rather unassuming black car, his sensei in the driver's seat. An hour later, they returned to UA, spirits much higher. Kirishima had a bag in hand, 4 new boxes of his regular hair dye inside, his usual bright grin on his face. Much better, Shota thought dryly. Try as he might, he can't deny that he preferred seeing his student happy. "Thank you, sensei." Kirishima ran into the dorm, but suddenly stopped, just short of the elevator. Shota sighed, pausing his walk to the teacher's side of the dorm building. What now? Kirishima rubbed a hand over his head, sheepish. Would you be able to help me? Put it on, I mean. I miss spots when I do it myself, and the rest of the squad are revising. Shota just closed his eyes tightly, surprisingly noting that he wanted to help Kirishima, even if it meant he was eating later than he originally thought. Fine, he finally answered, opening his eyes and following Kirishima to his room, pretending that the happy smile on Kirishima's face didn't make his heart swell. 10 minutes later, and he was lathering the dye onto his student's scalp gently, gloves covered in red, viscous dye. He wasn't even bothered when his sleeve got stained, and even less bothered when Kirishima's usual exuberance returned. At least, that's what he told himself. Later, whilst getting ready for patrol, Mike noticed the red stain. "What's that, Sho?" he asked, concerned. Shota just shook his head, pulling his scarf back around his neck. "Just red hair dye, don't worry," he replied. It took Mike a few seconds for the dots to connect, but when they did, he grinned and laughed. "That's cute," he said, ignoring Shota's mutters of anger and protests. 2 weeks later, it happened yet again. 1A was in the middle of heroics class, sparring without using quirks, Shota watching from afar with Yagi when it happened. One moment, Shoji and Sato were sparring normally. They usually pitted the two against each other, being the most similar in stature and size, grappling and pushing and punching, when the fight stopped altogether. Shota looked over, not seeing what the problem was at first, walking closer with Yagi at his side. More students noticed he was on the move, pausing in their fights too, following their sensei's eyes. When Shota reached the pair, he immediately saw what was wrong. In Sato's left hand was a piece of ripped, teal fabric, his eyes wide and cheeks flushed. Shoji was on his knees, multiple hands wrapped around the lower half of his face, eyes darting around the area, alit with panic. "Sato, what happened?" Snapping him out of his reverie, Sato stood straighter, finally taking his eyes off of his sparring partner. "Sensei, we were just sparring normally, but my hand... I caught his mask in my hand and tried moving, but I ripped it by accident. I didn't mean to." Shota reached out and patted Sato's shoulder, taking the fabric from his hand. "Calm down, Sato. No harm done." By now, the rest of the class had circled them, questions being whispered amongst themselves. Noting the fabric in his sensei's hand, Tokoyami stood forward. "Is that his mask, sensei?" Tokoyami asked. Shota nodded, for once unsure what to do. Tokoyami nodded in return, crouching by his friend, laying a hand upon Shoji's large shoulders. "Calm down, my friend. It's okay. No one saw." Saw what? Shota thought, before catching himself. He wasn't one to judge, or even care about how people looked, and he knew that asking that question, even in his mind, was juvenile. It wasn't his business. "All right, class, get back to your lesson," Shota said, marginally louder than normal. It didn't take everyone long to jump to his order, though, returning to sparring, but eyes rarely leaving the four still stood around Shoji. "I'll take care of this," Shota muttered to Yagi, inclining his head so that he couldn't see the knowing look on Yagi's face. Yagi merely nodded, walking back to the front of the class, leaving Shota and Tokoyami to crouch by Shoji's side. Tokoyami was still whispering reassurances to Shoji, hand squeezing his shoulder. Idea forming in his mind, Shota unraveled the capture weapon from his shoulders, shivering at the sudden breeze that assaulted his neck. He passed it off to Tokoyami, nodding his head at Shoji, before standing and joining Sato. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Sato nodded, shaking still. "Go and join All Might, then." Sato nodded again, walking off, leaving the three alone. Tokoyami had wrapped the capture weapon around Shoji's face, with Shoji relaxing slowly by the minute, his lower face now securely covered. That done, Tokoyami tugged his friend to his feet, hand wrapped tightly in one of Shoji's many. He led him away from ground beta and towards the dorms, passing Shota on the way. "Thank you, Aizawa-sensei," Shoji whispered, before continuing on his way. Stopping them from leaving hadn't even entered his mind. A few hours later, Shota made his way to the 1A dorms, ready to retrieve his capture weapon from Shoji. He hadn't seen him for the rest of the day, and safely assumed he'd just stayed in his room. Shota wasn't too mad about that. When he arrived at Shoji's room, however, he was surprised to see the room was packed up, more so than it already was. The futon was rolled up, the wardrobe was empty, and Shoji was in the process of dismantling his flat-pack desk and chair. "What are you doing?" he deadpanned, Shoji imperceptibly flinching at the sudden voice. The class wasn't back yet, still finishing up their last lesson, leaving just Shota and Shoji in the dorm building. "Packing, sensei," Shoji said, twisting the screwdriver to the left with one hand, the rest gripping the wood. "And why are you packing, Shoji?" he asked, just as monotone as the first. He had a reputation to uphold, after all. Shoji sighed, closing his eyes tightly and rubbing a hand over them. Shota noticed his face was covered by a mask again, a black one this time. His teal mask was currently with Bakugo, last he heard, him being the only one who knew how to stitch. That would have surprised him, but the boy was making leaps and bounds with the therapy after his kidnapping. Sato was terrified when he saw my face. How can I be a hero if the sight of my face scares people? He shook his head, as if to dispel those thoughts, and returned to unscrewing the tiny nails. Ah, so that's what this was about. Shota sighed too, sitting down on the floor beside his largest and yet one of his quietest students. "Personally, I think Sato was just afraid he'd hurt you or offended you. I doubt he'd care about what you looked like. I know no one else does. Tokuyami has a bird head, Koda has a different shaped head. Hagakure is invisible, and Principal Nezu is an animal of undetermined nature. You fit right in, Shoji." Comfort wasn't his forte, but Shoji didn't seem the type to like being coddled anyway. Shota could see he was contemplating his words slowly, eyes flickering this way and that. "You're right, but that doesn't mean I'm not still afraid of what they'd think of me." Whilst he spoke, Shoji shuffled over to the rolled-up futon, grasping a familiar piece of fabric and passing it off to his sensei. Shota nodded his thanks and wound it back around his neck. "You shouldn't be. You're here because you deserve to be, and you have the potential necessary to be a hero." "Respectfully, sensei, 54 teeth and Glasgow grin seem more villainous than heroic," Shoji muttered dryly. Shota huffed into his scarf, rolling his eyes. "I don't know where you got that term from, but who are you to decide what's villainous and what isn't? Quirks are quirks, along with the supposed mutations that may come with them. It's what you make of it that decides whether you're a hero or a villain. I can't stop you from leaving, but I do hope you rethink your decision. You belong here, and I am confident the rest of these problem children think so too." With that, he stood from his place on the floor, leaving the room. As he left, he threw a look over his shoulder to see Shoji with a hand to his face, looking around the room contemplatively, a confident look in his eyes. Shota hid his smile in his scarf again, taking his leave. Later that night, he returned to the dorm again to see all of 1A in the common room, sat around the table. Shoji was near to the middle, Tokuyami by his side. Bakugo had clearly finished with Shoji's mask, seeing it gripped in one of Shoji's hands. Sato had baked something. There was a sweet scent in the air, a tray of cookies on the table. The most surprising thing to see, however, was that Shoji had his mask pulled underneath his chin, leaving it loose and around his neck. He looked a little uncomfortable at being so exposed, but that bright confidence was still evident in his eyes. No one seemed scared or nervous at the sight of Shoji's wide mouth and many molars, and Shota felt his heart swell with pride at his class. He definitely didn't see the look that Mike gave him the day after, when Shoji was seen eating in the cafeteria with his normal mouth, unbothered by the stares from the rest of UA, especially when the whole of 1A was sat in the near vicinity around him, being as loud and obtrusive as ever. "Still cute," Mike shouted in his ear, unperturbed by the glare he received. It slowly came to his attention, a mere week after the shoji incident, that something had happened with Yayorozu Momo. That something, however, wasn't at all what he thought it would be. All week, she'd been flinching at people's touches, uncharacteristically unfocused in class, and looking like she wanted to say something, before losing confidence. She stayed behind one day after class, waving Jiro and Hagakure on. Shota was already zipped into his sleeping bag, having slept for most of the class, but stopped wriggling after seeing Yayorozu still here. "Do you need something?" Shota asked sleepily. Sort of." At the fear in her voice, Shota sat up straighter, looking his most intelligent student in the eyes. If it made her scared, it was probably serious. She didn't usually hesitate to speak her mind. "What happened?" he asked, trying not to show his alarm. It wouldn't do any good to get her riled up, but it was clearly unnecessary anyway, as she burst into tears immediately. It's not that important, I just..." Shota unraveled himself, reaching out with both hands and grasping her shoulders. "You can tell me, Yayorozu. I am here to listen." For a moment, that made her cry even harder, until Shota pulled her into his chest, unusually emotional and on edge. Something serious must have happened, if it caused this reaction. "Well, I was walking to the dorm building a few days ago when some third-years jumped me. They didn't hurt me, just kept touching my chest and saying things, inappropriate things, before leaving. I keep seeing them around school, and they won't leave me alone." When she was done, she all but collapsed into Shota's chest, gripping his capture weapon tight. Shota had never felt anger like this. Someone dared to assault Yayorozu like that, and thought they'd get away with it? He gripped her tighter, rage boiling his blood. They wouldn't get away with this. When she had calmed down enough to pull away, Shota pulled some tissues from his pocket and handed them to her, watching as she wiped her eyes. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said, quietly, unparalleled rage causing his hair to stand on end slightly. "I am sorry that you have been made uncomfortable in one of the few places that you should feel safe in. I promise, their actions will not go unpunished. You didn't deserve for this to happen to you." Yayorozu nodded, looking quite feeble. "What will you do?" He thought for a moment about sicking Bakugo on them, but bitterly remembered that it wasn't exactly hero-like, and settled for expelling and reporting them to the authorities. "Whatever I can," he replied, patting her head gently. "Do you think you'll be able to recognize them?" She nodded, and Shota breathed a sigh of relief. "Good," he said. "Follow me." Within the next few days, UA suddenly lost 4 students. But, as it turns out, no one was sad to see them go. Many of the female students had provided sufficient evidence for their grievances, enough that there wasn't even a case set in motion to expel them. Nezu merely looked at them with his beady eyes and kicked them off the grounds that day. Good riddance, Shota thought, seeing the happy grins of the female students of his class. The boys had protested, of course, claiming that they hadn't actually raped anyone, but before they could continue speaking, Shota lashed out with his capture weapon and wound it around their throats. No one had stopped him. Later that night, Shota returned to the teacher's lounge to see a post-it note stuck on his computer screen. "Thank you," it read, in Yayorozu's distinct handwriting. "From the UA girls." Mike had read it over his shoulder, giggling. "They love you!" he shouted, in a cringy sing-song voice, but it was choked off when Shota turned around, using his quirk on him. "Shut up," Shota muttered, folding it gently and tucking it into one of his many pockets. Mike laughed when he saw, but didn't press. With all that had happened recently, Shota was hoping for a peaceful few weeks, but of course, with his class, that was impossible. He was wandering the dorms late at night, looking for stragglers and those that had fallen asleep anywhere but their own beds, when he stumbled across a sight he had never expected to see. Bakugo was stood by an open window, cigarette in hand, looking out across the open plains of the UA grounds. "Bakugo," he said, standing by him. The boy didn't even seem surprised to see him, just inclining his head in his sensei's direction. It was the quietest Shota had ever seen him. The silence remained for a few minutes, only interrupted by the gentle hiss when Bakugo inhaled the smoke from the cigarette. It eventually burned out, though, and he stubbed it out against the brick wall, slipping the butt into his pocket. "Huh." "Good night, Sensei," Bakugo said, taking his leave. Shota watched him step into the elevator before returning to his own room. Well, that was unusual. Bakugo wasn't any different in class that morning, so it nearly entirely slipped Shota's mind, until he was wandering the dorm that night again, and found Bakugo stood at the same window, blowing smoke outside. Shota didn't say anything this time, and just stood at his student's side. If it was any other year, and Shota caught them smoking, he'd be throwing them out of the hero course immediately. But as it was, Bakugo had seen far more than the average hero student, and he was only 16. Healthy coping mechanisms were hard to come by these days, and Bakugo wasn't in the habit of taking things for granted anymore. He took help where he got it, and if a cigarette once a night kept him sane and alive, Shota wasn't going to take it granted for either. Bakugo finished, the same as he did the night before, slipping the butt into his pocket before leaving to sleep, and once again, Shota let him. On the third night, Shota found himself in the same place as the previous 2 nights. This night, Bakugo offered Shota a cigarette too, and although it was probably a bad idea, his habit years in his past, he took it, snorting when Bakugo lit it, with a tiny explosion from his fingers. He lit his own in a similar way, and the familiar silence reigned over them. "Why?" Shota asked, when he stubbed it out. Bakugo shrugged, putting his own out and slipping both butts into his pocket. "Could be worse, Sensei. I could be slashing my wrists. Or suicidal." Shota grimaced at the blunt words, but nodded, conceding. "Besides," Bakugo continued, pulling the window shut, "it's not affecting my studies, and nor is it causing me any trouble." Shota sighed as he walked off again, but stopped him just before he reached the elevator. "Just be careful, Bakugo. They're more addictive than you give them credit." Tch! Bakugo clicked his tongue, punching in the floor number. "Whatever." After that, Shota didn't make any more detours to Bakugo's windows, and for a few weeks it left his mind. Not forgotten, just left alone for a while. Bakugo was volatile, but he was mentally strong, and Shota knew he would make the right choice. He was proven correct, of course, when a few boxes of cigarettes found their way onto Shota's desk in the teacher's lounge around a week later. He wouldn't say it, but he was near to tears for a moment. When did this damn class make him cry? "You were right. Fuck you." Shota rolled his eyes at the note written on the lid of one of the boxes, tossing them into the bin. Mike had obviously already read the note, recognized the handwriting, and come to some conclusions, judging by the teasing grin he was receiving from across the room. "You're so good for them, Sho!" Mike yelled, laughing, intensifying Shota's already bad headache. "Fuck off, you bastard," Shota grumbled, secretly proud. He wouldn't tell that to Mike, though. Nah, his pride was pretty bruised already. A month or 2 of peace passed, with Eri joining the 1A family in the process. The school festival had been about 3 days ago, but the hype still hadn't settled. Eri was staying with Shota and Mike for now, often hanging around with Midoriya and Kirishima in the dorm rooms. Shota had been nervous at first, especially since her quirk wasn't entirely under control, but Mike reminded him that little Eri hadn't seen much of the outside world, and it was best that she was introduced slowly. Mirio had been helping a lot too, especially since she'd attached to Mirio and never really let go. He was quirkless now, of course, but still a hero in Eri's eyes. Shota would be lying if he said that he didn't cry upon seeing the look of absolute joy on Mirio's face, when she said that to him. Mirio, however, was still a cause for concern. Shota couldn't read minds, but if he could, he didn't doubt he would see a lot of self-esteem issues within Mirio's head. Losing Zernidae and becoming quirkless within the span of 24 hours couldn't be easy, especially since he was one of the big three, UA's most promising upcoming heroes. Quirkless heroes were uncommon enough as it is, but suddenly having your quirk one day and losing it the next, a whole quirk-planned future ahead, must be terrifying. He probably felt lost and alone. When he confessed that to Mike, he'd teased him about his dadzawa side, before silently agreeing. Mirio came around Shota's apartment in the 1A dorm building a fair few times a week, but every time he did, he seemed more somber and down than the last, as if his carefully placed facade was failing him. Eri had noticed too, especially when Mirio nearly snapped at her for asking one too many questions about his quirk. Shota wasn't mad, even if he'd come to see Eri as a daughter of sorts. If anything, he was more surprised when Mirio quickly excused himself after, tears welling in his eyes and apologies spilling from his lips, slamming the door behind himself. Well, shit. He would have run after him, but Mike was in the middle of his radio show, and he didn't really want to leave Eri alone. Scooping her into his arms, he pressed a kiss to her forehead, muttering reassurances that it wasn't her fault, before writing a short note for Mike and taking his leave. First, he dropped Eri off with Midoriya, who was all too happy to spend some time with her. Then, he took out his phone and sent a text to Mirio. He had given him his number after he'd looked after Eri a few times, deeming texting easier than going looking for him. No reply came within a few minutes, though, so he left the dorm building and made his way to the 3A dorm building. A quick check with the people sat in the common room showed that he wasn't there, so with a quiet curse under his breath, he left. Not one to rush into panicking, Shota took his time to look all around UA grounds, but the fear for Mirio's safety was mounting by the minute. Mirio wasn't impulsive or a danger to himself, but he clearly wasn't in the right state of mind to be alone right now. Shota cursed himself for not stepping in sooner. He saw the way Mirio's smile slipped as soon as Eri or Mike weren't looking. He saw the way that his eyes held pain sometimes, or saw the way he held himself, curled and tight, hands gripping whatever he held a touch too tightly. It was heartbreaking, and not at all the Mirio he had known a few months ago. Shota sighed as he made his way to the UA building roof, praying to any deity out there that he wouldn't be up there, but he'd checked literally everywhere else, and there was no place he could be, unless he'd left UA grounds completely. He pushed the rickety iron door open, heart clenching at seeing Mirio curled up in a fetal position, far too close to the edge for his own safety. "Mirio," he said, breathless, running to his side and dropping to his knees. The boy's sleeves had slipped up a little in the panic to reveal scratches, and lots of them. Shota clenched his hands, knowing it wasn't the time to pick up on it. Togata, please, calm down." Mirio curled up a little tighter at those words, and Shota breathed deeply, knowing he was going about this the wrong way. He slumped down beside one of his kindest and most joyful students, hands itching to wrap him in a hug, but knowing how strange it'd be. Mirio's stuttered breaths were the only thing he focused on, sighing in relief when they evened just slightly. He remained by his side nevertheless, watching the darkening sky above them. "I'm sorry, Sensei." Shota nearly flinched when Mirio spoke, heart crying out at the broken and tired voice. "I shouldn't have snapped at Eri. It was my fault. She was just being curious." Shota finally gave in to the urge, placing a hand on one of Mirio's arms, careful to not grip in the inside too tightly and cause the poor boy any more unnecessary pain. "You're allowed to feel overwhelmed, Mirio. Eri isn't a normal child, but children always ask too many questions. If you ever feel the need to step away from the situation, please let me know." Mirio nodded, but dropped his head into his hands a moment later. "I'm not okay. I don't even know how I got to be like this. One day I was fine, and the next, I was losing two of the most important aspects of my life. Right now, I want nothing more than to throw my body off of this building." At that confession, Shota gripped Mirio even tighter, closing his eyes as if to not hear the words left in the air. "Everything hurts," Mirio whispered, silent tears rolling down his face. "Amajiki and Hado pity me. All Might can't bear to look at me, and Midoriya walks on eggshells constantly. If this is what life is like, then I don't want it. It's so shit. I can still be a hero, sure, but what good can I do without my quirk? That was my one shot at life. I worked so damn hard to make it as powerful as it was, and now that's all thrown away. No one will hire a quirkless hero anyway. I might as well quit before I even start." Shota hummed, wanting to comfort Mirio, but knowing, more than anything, that he was speaking the truth. Quirkless heroes fall through within a year of being a hero, simply because they can't do what those with quirks can. They are underpaid, unwelcome, and targeted, making them a liability more than anything. "I'm truly sorry for what has happened to you, Mirio. None of this was your fault. Please realize that. There is more to life than becoming a hero, and although I know it's your dream aspiration of the world, and I know you would be a good hero with or without your quirk, there are other things you can do that make you happy. I, for one, know that Eri looks up to you, perhaps even as an older brother. Amajiki and Hado love you, as do Mike and I. All Might is a fool, and he should be by your side. But the man lost someone too, and it will probably take more time for him to approach you. What I'm trying to say is that you have more people that care for you than you realize. Perhaps you just see yourself as an effective asset at calming Eri down, and as someone to help her into the real world. But I know that you love her as much as she loves you. You have a family with us here, Mirio. You always will. Sure, throwing yourself off this building would take away your pain, and maybe it feels like the only thing that will solve it all, but I promise it isn't. So many would be left devastated without you in their world. Don't tell Mike or One Eye I said this, because my hard-ass reputation is ruined already, but we see you as a son. Sir Night-Eye wouldn't want you to do this. Please, Mirio." Shota cringed at the desperation in his voice, but the occasion required it. Why doesn't Mirio see how utterly loved he is? "You are more important to us than someone to look after Eri. You're more important to your friends than your rep as one of the big three. You are loved." He reached out with his other hand, pulling the sobbing Mirio into his arms. He ran a hand through the unwashed, dirty blonde hair, cupping his cheek with the other. Mike would tease him relentlessly, but Shota genuinely cared for these kids, each and every one of them, Mineta rightfully excluded, and wanted them all to excel in life. So yeah, sue him for giving a shit. I'm sorry, Sensei." Mirio's voice cracked, and Shota's heart couldn't take much more. "Please, Mirio, come back with me." He hugged Togata even tighter. He wouldn't let go, even if Mirio wanted him to. Thankfully, he felt the soft nod against his chest, and immediately leapt to his feet, refusing to let go of him but wanting more than anything to be off the roof. He'd drag him with his capture weapon if necessary. But no, Mirio walked back to the dorms with him. They didn't pass anyone on the way, and Shota thanked every star in the darkened sky for it. An hour later, Shota and Mike were sat across Mirio, who was sleeping peacefully, curled up on one of their couches, Eri curled in with him. Shota finally breathed a sigh of relief, clenched Mike's hand tight in his own, letting a few tears loose. "What will we do, Mike?" he whispered, shaking slightly. "We'll get through it," Mike replied, quiet for once. "Together, as we always do." Yeah, that sounded good. Together. 3 months later, Kirishima's hair was still red all over. Shoji was more comfortable within 1A than he'd ever been, although he still wore a mask out and about and incorporated it within his hero costume. Yaoyorozu and the rest of the girls at UA were safe for now, although Shota knew he couldn't protect them from the horrors of the world forever. Bakugo still attended therapy, and his attitude is better than ever with no cigarettes in sight, and Mirio was still alive. Only just into their second year at UA, Class 1A had gained more than just knowledge and skills and strength. They'd gained a family, in the form of 2 dads, 21 other siblings, with Mineta having been expelled shortly after with the other boys, and substituted with Shinso Hitoshi, including Mirio and Eri, and a heck of a lot of aunts and uncles. Sure, it wasn't formal, but Shota would be lying if he said he didn't love it. Maybe he hadn't seen it at first, but one day, a few weeks after Togata's breakdown and subsequent move into Shota's apartment, Shota walked into the 1A common room to see everyone he would soon come to realize as a family and stood, shocked, for a moment. They weren't even doing anything shock-worthy, merely talking and laughing amongst each other. But seeing Mirio, Eri, and Shinso in the middle, with Mike at the front, yelling as always, he couldn't help but recognize what he was feeling as love. Shota had dismissed the idea of love for a very long time, only allowing Mike into his slightly fractured heart, but in the end, he supposes that maybe it wasn't so bad after all. That decided, he sat down next to Mirio, ignoring the looks of surprise from the rest of the occupants in the room, and hugged Eri close. Yeah, love was pretty fucking cool. Hello everyone, this is IcarusAudios, and I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did. This was part 1 of the Show Me Hope Again series, which I will be continuing in the future. You can find Anathemis on Archive of Our Own, or through the link in the description. If you like the content and want more in the future, click the subscribe button to be notified when a new podfic comes out. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.